Good to go. All right, well, I hate to cut off all the great visiting around the tables, but we have a full story to tell you tonight. And when I say we, it's not the royal we. Callie's actually going to be helping me a little bit with part of our story tonight. Callie's one of our interns, and so she's going to do kind of one part of the story for you tonight. But I'm going to start it off. But before we do that, we're just going to open in a word of prayer. You might not have heard, but Jonathan Leun's mom passed away, I think, this morning. And so we're going to pray for Johnny and the family. And so in addition to just praying that God would bless our evening together. So let's bow together. Father, we thank you that you are good, that you are our Father, that we can hear stories of men and women just like us who you called to serve in some amazing ways. And Father, we don't hold them up as superheroes to be worshiped. We hold them up as examples to be encouraged by. And so we pray that as we hear Darlene Diebler's story tonight, it would just be a joy to us of what your people have done to take the gospel to the nations. And we do pray as well for Jonathan and his family. Just care for them, give them wisdom as they take next steps and make plans. And Father, we just are thankful that this is a family that loves you and is able to trust you even through this hard time. We pray this all in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, well, let's see here. We aren't quite started yet. There we go. This is Darlene Diebler, and our story actually starts, I suppose, when Darlene was 9. Anyone here 9? Close to 9? No 9-year-olds. Well, Darlene was 9 when I want to start her story, and it was a cold winter night when Darlene and her mom were listening to the radio. And on the radio that night was a man who was speaking about God. And his name was Robert Brown. And he was quite a well-known evangelist and speaker back in the early part of the 1900s, because we're roughly around the year 1926 when Darlene was 9 years old, and she heard on the radio with her mom the message about Jesus. And on the radio, this man encouraged people to go to a church. So Darlene's mom had a coworker who went to church, and so they had an invitation, sort of a standing invitation from this coworker who had said, we go to such and such a church. And so Darlene and her mom decided they would go to church. And so the very next Sunday, they walked 4 miles through a blizzard to a church they'd never been before. When they got there, the wind was blowing so strong they couldn't open the door. Someone had to open it from the inside, and they went in, and that night they heard the gospel, and they heard about Jesus, and they gave their lives to Jesus. A full year later, Darlene heard the same man who was on the radio speaking in their church, and he brought a missions challenge. And the missions challenge, this all took place, by the way, this is Boone, this is the city, Boone, Iowa. The missions challenge was for young people like college-age students and high school students to commit their lives to missions. And Darlene at that point was 10 years old, and she sat there in the church service, and she said, I felt a hand on my shoulder. And she turned around to see who it was, but there was no one there. And she realized God was speaking to her. This challenge wasn't just for an older high school student or a Bible school student, that God was calling her to missions. And so she said it was like God was saying, will you go? And her answer at that point, and it remained her answer through the life, was this: Lord, I will go anywhere for you, no matter what the cost. Now, as a 10-year-old girl, she couldn't fathom what the cost was going to be, but that's the story we want to tell you tonight. Now, fast forwarding about 10 years to a point where she was at a young people's rally. She had finished high school. She was an incredible evangelist. By the time she graduated from high school, she had shared the gospel with every student in her school. And she went off to Bible school. She was in her first year of Bible school, but she came home to Boone, Iowa. And while she was home, there was a young people's rally in Boone at her church. She went, and there was a mission speaker, a man by the name of Russell Diebler. He was from Borneo. He had been serving God over in Borneo on the other side of the world. And he was there to challenge and encourage young people to pursue missions and to follow the Lord. And after the talk, she was hurrying out. She was supposed to meet a friend. And all of a sudden, she felt someone reach out and grab her arm. And she turned around, and there was a woman from her church, and she said, I want you to meet the mission speaker. And so she met this man by the name of Russell. Trying to be polite, she said, well, I'm in Bible school, and next year if you come to, where was she? She was somewhere in St. Paul, in a Bible school there. She said, if you come to St. Paul where I'm a student, would you speak to our student body? And he agreed he would. And off she went, not really ever thinking she was going to see this man again. But the following spring, there was special missions speakers and trips and big rallies and things going on. And she was at Bible school, and she looked up, and there on the stage was this man. And he looked out, and he was smiling at her. And she thought it was a little bit weird. In fact, every time she sort of looked up, there he was looking at her and smiling at her. And she decided after this rally that she was going to leave as quickly as she could. She didn't want to see this man at all. And so she tried to get out really quick, but he was not to be denied. He was pretty determined. In fact, what she did is she hid in the cafeteria of the school because she knew he was out there watching for her. So she hid in the cafeteria, waited for everyone to leave. Whoop, that gives you a clue what's coming next, doesn't it? Wow, spoiler alert. She hid in the cafeteria, and she decided she would wait for everyone to leave. Everyone had finally left. She stepped out of the cafeteria, and there he was right there waiting for her. And he told her that he had been visiting her family back home in Boone. What he didn't tell her was that he had visited her family back home in Boone because God had told him this was going to be the woman he was to marry. And so he decided he would go to Boone, Iowa. He would meet her family. He would get to know all about her. He would ask her dad for permission to marry him. And her dad gave him permission on the condition that he could win his daughter's heart. And so he had known all about her. Now, she was really tempted, she said, just to run. She didn't really want anything to do with him, but he was pretty persistent. A little bit later, again, one of these meetings, he was on the stage, again, looking at her. Again, she decided after the meeting she was going to get back on their bus so that she could get away as quick as she could to not see this man. And as she was doing that, he asked her just before she got on the bus if she would go out for dinner with him the next night. And she said, no, I'm not going to do it. I'm busy. Not interested. Well, he said, well, I'll be in the lobby of the hotel I'm staying at 6:30. If you're interested, meet me there. She got back on the bus, and she was sitting on the bus, and all the other girls on the bus were talking about this guy, of how handsome he was and how they wished they could date this guy. And she thought, well, that's funny. She said, I actually have the chance to go out with him. And so she decided, not that she was really interested to marry him, but she decided, well, everyone else wants to go on a date with him. He's asked me out, so I'll go to dinner with him. So the next night she went out for dinner. They went out for Chinese food. And the conversation was apparently incredibly awkward. In fact, they really didn't know what to say. She was kind of confused because she didn't know that he was interested, didn't really know that he had spent all this time getting to know her family. Finally, in the middle of the silence, she said this. She said, well, a penny for your thoughts. And he said, do you really want to know? She said, yes. He said, well, I would like to marry you. Can you imagine that? A man that you've never really even met, known, and he announces he wants to marry you. And she said, well, you don't even know me. He said, well, actually, I do know you. And he went on to tell her all about herself because he had got to know her through her family. In fact, not only did he get to know her parents back in Boone, Iowa, he had actually traveled to visit her sister and meet her sister who lived in a different state altogether. So he knew all the family. He told her all about herself. She was sort of blown away, but she still decided, there's no way I want to marry this man. In fact, she told him, it's not that I'm not going to marry you, I'm not going to marry anyone. I'm going to go to the mission field as a single woman. That was her plan. That night, they went back to this evening service at this youth rally, and she said simply this. He reached over, he touched her arm, she looked at him, and she knew in that moment, this is the man I love, and this is the man I'm going to marry, and this is the man I'm going to go to the mission field with. God just did this amazing work. So the next morning she woke up, there was a letter for her because Russell Diebler had to travel on. At 6 o'clock in the morning, he left her this letter, and the letter said, I had no idea that you were 12 years younger than me. I can't marry you. It's just not right, and not only is it not right, the mission board is never going to approve this. They won't allow such a young woman to go to the mission field with an older man. And so she now was quite confused because she thought she was in love with this man and he loved her and they were going to get married. And so the decision was made. They decided if the mission board would approve it, they would go. They went all through the interviews with the mission board. The interviewers never once asked her age. They approved her. They approved them. And they got married in the summer of, there we go. Now you can see it. August 18th, 1937. At this point, the mission board was really anxious to get people overseas. Lots of tensions around the world, if you think of what's going on at this point. So they were trying to get people into mission fields. And the field that they had in mind for this couple was the Dutch New Guineas over in what's now modern-day Indonesia. And so they needed to learn the Dutch language. And so they sent them overseas to Holland. They were only able to be there for 6 months. And this is a picture of them there in Holland learning the language. After 6 months, they put them on a ship and they arrived in the Dutch New Guineas on their anniversary on August 18th, 1938. And that is where I'm going to hand things over to Callie, who's going to tell you a little bit more of what takes place next.
All right, can you all hear me? Awesome. So Russell and Darlene arrived in Batavia on their first wedding anniversary. Upon arrival, just to give you an idea of the culture, they were surrounded by a bunch of islands called the Spice Islands. So there were lots of smells like cinnamon, nutmeg, and cloves in the area. There were markets full of fruits and vegetables and woven things, and a multi-use city canal where people swam, did laundry, and even bathed close by. Darlene and Russell met up in Makassar with a bunch of missionaries, and among them were the Jaffreys. Dr. and Mrs. Jaffrey were the ones to encourage all the missionaries to ask God his will if they should go and serve in this place. So they'd be assured that where God wanted them to, so that they'd be assured they were where God wanted them to be, rather. Dr. Jaffrey had been a missionary for a long time and was a spiritual mentor to them. So the morning after their arrival, Darlene had her first Indonesian language lesson. Her tutor was introduced, and he immediately left the room and came back in, and he said a phrase to Darlene, which I won't try to repeat because I don't speak Indonesian. Darlene didn't respond because she didn't have any idea what he said. So he left again and came back, repeated the phrase, and she realized it was a greeting of some sort. So she repeated the greeting word for word, and the tutor frowned and shook his head, gesturing wildly, repeating the last word of the phrase and replacing it with another. And Darlene, trying hard not to laugh, realized her mistake. She just said to the man, "Good morning, Mrs." So she learned her lesson and never again called a man Mrs. So as time went on, Russell prepared to travel to New Guinea to make God known among the people there. He and Darlene spent hours researching that. They, along with Walter and Viola Post, two of the other missionaries, were appointed to the Whistle Lakes, and there should be a slide for that. So Russell and Walter left in early December. During this time, Darlene kept busy with translating Sunday school lessons. There you can see the lakes behind me. Speaking in chapels and supervising teachers, all while learning the language. So 2 months later, Darlene learned that Russell was coming home. So she went to the village of Manokwari to meet him. She saw Walter, and standing next to him, a sickly man, almost unrecognizable rather, but then she realized it was her husband. They sent for a doctor who came to examine Russell's feet. And I have a feeling this may be Pastor Don's favorite part of the story, so it was the one he wanted me to tell the most. It turns out that Russell had a severe case of something called jungle rot. And the doctor instructed Darlene every morning to take a tweezer and tear off every layer of tissue until you see the throbbing flesh. And don't apply the ointment I'm giving you until that rotting tissue is removed. Pretty gross, pretty unpleasant, pretty painful, but it was the only way to get rid of the infection. So during these treatments, Russell began to talk about his trip. The first 3 days, he and the carriers traveled upstream. They arrived at Orawaha, now with only 7 carriers as some had gotten sick. The trail was pretty hazardous, leading them up high mountain ranges. And Russell was concerned, so he opened his Bible to Joshua 1 verse 9 and was encouraged that God was with him through it all. He prayed that the remaining men would stay with him, and they did. On the 18th day of traveling at the top of the 14th mountain range, the trail eventually led to some canoes by the river. After paddling some, they realized it was too dangerous to continue with high waters and currents. They waited in the canoes for 6 hours until they were able to paddle against the current and into the lake. At midnight on January 13th, 1939, Russell reached the village. In the morning, he met the people there. The culture and styles were pretty different from anything we've likely seen. Men wore a pig tusk or a piece of bamboo through a hole in their nose, right about here usually, and women wore a reader's stick in the same way. It's not every day you see that. The Kapaku houses had walls of planks, tree bark roofs, and dirt floors. They grew over 30 kinds of sweet potatoes and ate those among insects and small creatures, which is quite the diet. One morning, after Russell had finished telling of his journey, while Darlene tended to his feet, Dr. Jaffrey came in, and upon seeing the feet, he left the room feeling rather sick. So he stayed in his room all day, didn't come out for lunch or anything, because he was just absolutely disgusted. He wrote later in a field magazine, "What a nauseating sight that is. But as I walked from the room, the Lord kept saying to me, 'Oh, but to me, they are beautiful feet.'" The second time Russell went to the Whistle Lakes, he was more prepared and had a better crew with him. In a letter back to Darlene, he shared that the people in the village were convinced he was a spirit. They believed he had come from a spirit world beyond the mountains, and given there were no women with him, that made them spirits. So Russell sent for Darlene. She and Viola Post started their journey there on February 5th. They soon got to Russell and Walter and went to the base camp. And the Kapakus, the people in the village, they met the men there. They asked, "Where is your woman?" So the woman came out. They circled Darlene and they looked at the whiteness of her skin, kind of pinched her arms to see if she was real. And upon that, they walked up the trail. The carriers went ahead and called out to the village, "The women are here. They're not spirit people." And one day, switching gears a bit, at their home in the village, they pulled out a radio and switched on the news. That's where they learned that the war had begun. They praised God, despite that, because they were safe in the village. But then they heard soon after they were to abandon their homes because of the war. They were sad they had to leave, but looked to God for comfort. They traveled to Orawaha and waited for their ship to arrive to take them to Ambon as the effects of the war came into sight. Back on Celebes, working in the Bible school there, they kept trusting in the Lord and serving him, even though that probably wasn't where they wanted to be. One morning, they learned that Pearl Harbor had been bombed by Japan, and ships were on their way to protect those in the East Indies, while the missionaries were sending their students away so they would stay safe. They struggled to encourage people through this to stay strong when there was nothing but defeat to report. And they soon learned that there was a ship waiting to evacuate all foreigners and Dutch women and children who wanted to leave. That's the ship up behind me there. A truck was to pick them up 2 days later. So they gathered to pray about it, and Dr. Jaffrey advised them to not discuss their decision with one another, but ask the Lord instead for guidance and direction. So 2 days later, the truck arrived, and nobody felt led to leave. They had the opportunity, and they didn't take it. 3 days later, they found out the ship they would have gone on had been torpedoed and sank with no known survivors. So that's all I have to say. I'm going to hand it back to Pastor Don.
Yeah, it's worth clapping. That's pretty. That's not an easy thing to do. And you just never know who we might pick next time to come up here and tell the story with us. So it's you just never know when your turn's going to be up. So Callie got us up to the point where they were back. They had decided to stay. The war had broken out, and they had to make some very difficult decisions. By this point, everyone had moved into Dr. Jaffrey's house. This is the man. He was basically kind of like the father of the missions family that were in this part of Indonesia. You can imagine what it would have been like for the whole missions team to all be living together in one house, but they were just thankful that they were safe. It was sort of a little bit off the beaten track, and so even though now this whole area had been captured by the Japanese, they felt fairly safe. No soldiers had arrived until March 5th. Darlene was working out in the garden when she heard the footsteps of a soldier coming up behind her, and she said she turned around and looked, and there was a Japanese man with a gun, with a bayonet, and she said, "I peed my pants." She was so scared. They gathered up all the missionaries, and they began to basically interrogate them to find out where they were from. Now, most of them were Americans, which was a very bad thing. A few of them were Canadians, and the Japanese soldiers had no idea where Canada was or what it was. They couldn't really even pronounce the word. The man who was asked first stuttered when he was asked what country he was from. He was like, Canada. And so the Japanese didn't know what this place was, which might in the end have been a bit of a mercy because they sort of left the missionaries alone at Dr. Jaffrey's house for a little while until one day they heard a vehicle come. It was there to gather all the men. And so all the men were told that they were to gather whatever belongings they had. They were not allowed a suitcase. And so Darlene, thinking very quickly, grabbed a pillowcase, put her husband's Bible in it, a couple changes of clothing, his shaving material, and one pen. and was able to gather up that little bit. She got it to him. He was already in the back of the truck, and his words to her, these would be his final words to his wife after being married for just a very brief time. It was this: remember one thing, my dear, God said he would never leave us or forsake us. We'll pick up that part of the story in a little bit, but the other man that was, of course, there was Dr. Jaffrey himself. It's sort of a funny little story because he was gathering up his possessions as well, and he was known to sweat profusely. Some of us can relate to that, but not having deodorant, the thing he did was he used a lot of cologne to try to, make it smell not so bad. And so he was gathering up all this cologne, and the Japanese soldier who came into the room thought it was medicine. And so this soldier went back to Darlene and said, "What's wrong with this man?" And she started kind of listing a few medical things that had gone wrong with him. She was confused. She didn't know what was going on. And so the Japanese soldier finally just said, "We're not going to take him. Like, he's much too ill. If he needs all that medicine, there's no way he's going to survive." Darlene's thinking, like, what medicine? He doesn't take any medicine. Afterwards, found out that he had been packing up all his bottles of cologne because he figured wherever he was going to go was going to be a pretty sweaty place. And she was reminded as her husband drove off that day that she had pledged to God that she would follow him anywhere and that there would be no cost too great. They would stay in that little compound, in that house for about a year. Now, the hard part of it is they had not planned to be there for a year. They had next to no food. And so if any of our kids are looking for an idea of what to draw, I want you to draw like the tastiest looking bug that you can imagine, because over the course of the year, they had to get very creative in what they ate, including bugs. In fact, Darlene one day was served something that she thought at first was like a cheese curd in a coconut shell. And she started to eat it. She said, actually, it was really quite good. Only after a few minutes did she sort of clue in that this wasn't cheese. And as she began to ask what it was, turned out it was flying ants that the kids had caught and they had fried, and that they were all eating these things. But she said it was actually quite good. In addition to that, they ate weeds and ferns. They would grind up whatever sort of seeds they could get and turn it into what she called porridge. I'm not sure it was exactly the kind of porridge we're used to. But after about a year, the soldiers had came back. They kind of took whatever possessions there were of value, including all of her wedding presents. So she had arrived as basically a brand new married woman with all her wedding presents. The soldiers came and they took everything. But Dr. Jaffrey had two prized possessions. One was a flashlight, which, interestingly enough, all the years that they were in the prison camps, the batteries never wore out, even though he used it every day. The other was his father's watch. Quite valuable things, which you would think the Japanese soldiers would want to take. But every time they would come in, he would take off the watch, and he would take the flashlight, and he would put it under his pillow. The soldiers would come in and ransack the house, and never in all that time looked under his pillow. And Darlene asked him one time, like, "Why don't they look under your pillow?" And he just simply said, I just tell the Lord, I need these things more than them. I need to be able to read my Bible, and that's the only light we have. And that watch is the only thing of value that was left from my father. And Lord, if you would just leave that for me, it'd be such a gift. And in all those years, he never lost his watch or his flashlight. One of the biggest problems they had was rats. So I do apologize. Some of these stories are a little bit interesting. We're trying to, PG them here. But it wasn't that the rats came in to eat the food because they had no food. The rats came in to eat their clothing. And so at night, they would hear scurrying all through the house. So they decided eventually they were losing too many shoes and pieces of clothing, and they had almost nothing. So they decided to stay up all night, night after night, to kill off these rats. And so they would get brooms, and they would be there, and they would beat the rats to death. Well, one night, Darlene said she heard the rats scurrying around. They were louder than usual. And so she jumped out of bed, grabbed a broom, came storming out of her house to discover that her home was filled with bandits, robbers. And they were stealing what little was left. And she said there was a robber, he had a giant machete, and all she could think of was, he's not going to take what little I have left. And so she chased this man with a broom out of her house. Unfortunately, the robbers on the way in had broken down the doors, and so that night they actually boarded up the house from the inside to try to protect themselves and to try to protect what little they had left. Like I said, it was about a year into this that they finally were moved. The Japanese soldiers came back and said, the place you're living is far too luxurious, and so we're going to move you to a new place. They were taken to a very small house. It had 2 rooms and a hall. And that little house was the home for 7 women and 1 man, and I think there was a few kids as well. And so they would put up beds in various places. Again, there wasn't a lot of food to eat, so they were just trying to survive on what little they could get out of the forest. And that's how they continued until May of 1943. When they found out the men who had been taken were now moved into a men's prisoner of war camp, they had heard just a tiny little bit from one day when a prisoner had smuggled a pen out of that prison camp, and inside the pen there was a small little note that just reported that all their husbands were still okay, and that was about all they had news from their husbands over all this time. And they were moved, as I mentioned, there in May, and were ordered that they would be able to take nothing, only what they could sort of carry on their bodies. So Darlene put on all of her underwear and 4 pairs of clothing. Apparently it was brutally hot. They were taken, all of them, into a small church. So that night there was 1,000 people that slept, or didn't sleep, I think is more accurate, in this small church. Now, I'm not sure. Oh, I'm missing pictures. It's hard to keep track. Well, let's jump back here. That is the town, by the way, where they were living on the outskirts as all this is taking place. They took the ladies to a new prisoner of war camp that they were building. There was 8 barracks. Each barracks was basically a different ethnicity, except for barracks number 8, where Darlene would come to live. It was known as the Heinz Barracks, Heinz 57. In this barracks, there were women from, I have a list here, there were English, Dutch, German, Jewish, Canadian, American, Indonesian, Armenian, Scottish, Irish, Czechs, and Russians, all in this one barrack. And each barracks had to have a leader of the barracks. Darlene was chosen as the leader of her barracks because she could speak 3 languages. And even as a young woman, she was viewed as just a really wise person. And so she kind of grabbed the reins and led her barracks each night. She spent time leading them in worship of God and reading God's word, even though not all of them were Christians. But these were very, very difficult days. The women in this prison camp were essentially laborers for the Japanese army. So in addition to building roads and cutting down trees, their main thing was to sew clothing for the Japanese soldiers and to raise food. And so in this prison camp, the main food item that they were raising were pigs. So the pigs got 3 hot meals a day. The pigs were bathed quite frequently, and the women would have to take water from the well. They didn't even have enough water to bathe themselves, but the pigs were constantly washed and kept clean and fed. The women, on the other hand, had virtually nothing to eat. Their workday started at 4 in the morning when they would be fed a porridge-type substance. I never did quite figure out from all of what I read and heard exactly what was in it. But I do know that on one day in particular, the porridge was delicious. She said all the ladies were enjoying it so much, it tasted like chicken, and they just couldn't understand where they got chicken because during this time, there was no meat for any of the people. There was meat for the pigs, but not for the ladies. And so they were eating this and enjoying this until all of a sudden the light started getting a little bit brighter. Remember, they were up working at 4 in the morning. It was dark still. And as the daylight came and they looked in the pot, they realized there were feathers, and then they saw a tail, and then they saw the bodies of birds and a rat, and they figured there had been a bird's nest up above the big pot, and a rat had tried to get up there to get the birds, and in the scuffle, they had all fallen into the pot, and they had eaten all this food. Most of the ladies threw up, but Darlene, and this will tell you a bit of how strong she was, Darlene said, once I'd gotten that down, there was no way I was giving that back up. And so she was able to keep that down. The work that they did was pretty grueling. They worked like from before sunup until sundown. As I said, in a variety of tasks. In addition to all the work they were doing for the Japanese army, there was things like trying to run the kitchen because they were responsible to feed themselves what little food there was. There was a hospital that they had with no medicine. Some of our medical people will get an amazing sort of, I was going to say a laugh out of this, but it's not all that funny, but it's quite interesting. There was once a little boy who had tonsillitis. They had no medicine. They had no anesthetic. They had no scalpels. There was a doctor who used a piece of wire and removed his tonsils with no medication, no gauze, nothing, but managed to save this little guy's life. There's actually quite a few stories like that of the kind of things that they had to do to survive in this prison camp, but they did manage to survive. Another huge problem, because they're raising pigs, this is basically a gigantic pig farm, was flies. Hundreds and thousands and millions of flies. And so the prison commander, a man by the name of Mr. Yamaguchi, he ordered that every day every woman was to catch 100 flies. And so they started doing this, but it was incredibly time-consuming work because they had work quotas that each barracks had to do every day. And so trying to catch all these flies was just incredibly time-consuming. So they took to going into the latrine. Anyone know what a latrine is? Like the outhouse? And they would reach down into the outhouse and grab a handful. They said every time they put a hand in, out would come 100 flies. It was pretty gross situation that they had to live through. These were some of the pictures, by the way, of the prison camp. They're pretty blurry, so I apologize for that. There were some interesting humorous notes to this time. One day, Darlene noticed that she was being asked some really strange questions. And she didn't really understand what was going on. Ladies who she didn't know, quite a big prison camp, would come up to her and ask her things. She thought, well, it's a weird question. And then one day she heard some of the kids, because this was a camp for women and kids, she heard some of the boys from her barracks talking with boys from another barracks. And she realized that there was something a little fishy going on. So she took these boys aside who she knew from her barracks and said, could you explain to me what's happening? And they finally owned up to what was going on. You know, if you ever go to school, sometimes they'll have the, boys, my dad could beat your dad up, that kind of a thing. Well, in the prison camp, there were no dads there. And so what they were boasting about was, our barrack leader is better than your barrack leader. Except Darlene really didn't have much of a resume to her name. She was quite a young woman, hadn't done much. A lot of the women in these camps were quite influential women. They were a lot of them from the States and Europe over there as diplomats and those kind of things. And so the boys in Darlene's barracks had made up a story about her, that she was a wealthy American. She was a pilot, and she had been an actress, and her father was a very wealthy man. And all of a sudden, the lights went on. She said she thought back to the questions the women had asked. And one time, she was asked, is your father an oil man? And they were a very poor family, by the way. In fact, her father, by the time she was a young child, had a heart condition, so he actually wasn't able to work. Her mother worked as a waitress, essentially, to support her husband and 4 kids. And she sort of laughed, and she said, no, my father's a lumberman, because before he had gone off work, he had worked in a sawmill. Another time, the lady asked her, it's like, have you flown, what was the kind of plane? There was a certain kind of plane. And she just laughed. She said, well, no, I haven't been in anything bigger than a twin engine. She had once flown one time in a little plane. Another time, someone said, well, when you get home, do you think you'll make a film about this? And she actually said she laughed until she couldn't laugh anymore, and she said, right, we'll call it Rags to Riches and Campilli, which is the prison camp. She just thought the whole thing was a joke, and all of a sudden realized all these women thought she was this rich, famous American actress. She made the boys promise to never do that again, and in exchange, she decided she wouldn't tell the rest of the story to these other women so they could kind of be a little bit protected in the story that they had made up. Eventually, word got to her that her husband was quite ill. It was November of that year. It was not too many months in. One of the women had heard about it and passed this news on to her, trying to cushion the blow. And when she said, well, how ill is he? It turns out he had been ill. The illness had progressed, and he had died by this point. Darlene was devastated. You can imagine she had only been a bride for just a very short time. The ministry that God had called them to didn't seem to have even got off the ground by the time she had lost her husband. She was called into the commander's office in the prison camp, and he was a very brutal man. I tried to find a picture of him. We won't get into all of it, but you can kind of use your imaginations on this kind of thing. He had ruled this prison camp with an iron fist. Many people suffered greatly under his rule. He called her into his office. He knew that she had huge influence over all the rest of the women, and so he was worried that in her grief she might incite trouble. So he made her promise that she would not do that. And he actually told her that there are many women back in Japan who are suffering in the same way that she are, and she was just devastated at the thought of this. But the Lord spoke to her, and she asked him permission to speak. Now, this is a very bold thing. I think the last person who had stood up to him suffered very greatly for doing it. But she asked permission to speak, and he agreed. And she shared the gospel. In fact, she shared her own story of being a girl growing up in Boone, Iowa, and coming to know the love of God and what God had done. And she ended her talk with him as he began to cry. Tears are coming down his face. And she said, maybe God brought me to this place to tell you how much he loves you. In his tears, he walked out of his office. She said they were never allowed to leave the office until they were dismissed. So she said she didn't know what to do. She said she just stood there for the longest time praying for this man. She prayed that God would save him, but she also prayed that whatever he ate would make his stomach miserable and sick. So she said, I knew I needed to pray for my enemies and love them, but this was a pretty difficult man. And so she was praying for his salvation, but also knowing that she was still very human. Like I said, there were lots of hard things, lots of very courageous things that took place in that prison camp. One of the hardest things the women had to deal with was rabid dogs. I would have never even thought of this issue, but dogs that would be wild dogs, they would come at night. And so the women in these barracks, if they needed to leave to use the outhouse, of course, there was no lights and nothing like this, and the wild dogs would be there. They were rabid, so very, very dangerous. So a lot of the kids in these barracks took to just sort of digging small holes and using that as a bathroom in the night, which just led to the spread of dysentery. By this point, like about half the women and kids in the camp were violently ill. Many of them lost their lives to diseases like dysentery and malaria and these kind of things. But this one particular night, they were required to go out anytime there was an air raid siren, and they had dug ditches outside. They weren't allowed to stay in their barracks, and so if there's an air raid siren, they were required to go outside, hide in these ditches. They did it no matter what time of year it was. So at certain times of year, the ditches would actually be filled with water, and they were still required to go out and be in the ditches filled with water. This one night, as they were required to go out, a rabid dog was there, and a young woman by the name of Toos Hogenveen, she was apparently a beautiful young woman, the daughter of the governor of Bali, realized there was a rabid dog that was going to attack another one of the women or one of the kids, and she actually attacked this dog to save the lives of others. She was bit during the fight. They eventually were able to kill the dog, but she was badly bit, knew she had rabies. She actually went to the other woman in the prison camp and asked them to lock her into a small little hut where she went on and succumbed to rabies. I mean, just the courage. Darlene said this. She said, "True character surfaces when people are faced with danger and deprivation. Some surprised with their selfishness and greed, and others with their noble character, their courage, their fortitude, and their valor." The most frightening thing of all for them was when the Kempatites, sort of the secret police, would come, and they had a big black limousine, they called it. And various women would be taken away and be interrogated. They were trying to find spies. They were convinced within this prison camp there were women who were spies. A lot of the women who were taken away never came back. But on this particular day, May 12th, 1944, a car arrived, and Darlene knew she was the last American woman there, and this was going to be her turn. And she was taken into next level prison. Won't go into all of it, but I'll tell you a little bit of the stories. Her prison cell was 6 feet by 6 feet. Over the door of her prison room, it said in Japanese, the language she understood, "This person must die." She was on death row. She was going to be interrogated because she found out later that a Chinese man had accused her of being a spy, that she had a radio and she was reporting on the Japanese activity. They accused her of knowing Morse code, which she didn't know anything of, but she was put in this prison cell. She was allowed to bring next to nothing. So by this point, she almost had no possessions. She was allowed one dress. That's all she had. She had her Bible and rings confiscated from her, and she was thrown in this prison cell and left. It was not an easy time. I don't have any pictures of it, probably thankfully. I'll leave it a couple of the stories of what she went through, but it was a horrific experience. She had dysentery by this time, and so she was unable to eat. So with dysentery, I think there's a couple more pictures of this prison camp, right? Oh, that's a little bit later. With dysentery, they couldn't eat solid foods, and so one day they brought her a bowl of rice. She couldn't eat it, so the next day they brought her just a bowl of porridge. And so over the weeks and months to come, she would never be given water. All she would have was porridge. So with the porridge, there was enough liquid, enough fluid in it that she could sustain life, but there was not enough to ever clean herself or do anything like that. So she would literally spit on her hands and lick them off to keep herself clean. You see, she was required to keep this 6-foot square cell perfectly clean. And so while the mosquitoes would come in and constantly be, biting her and those kind of things, if she hit one on the wall, she was required to scrape them off or to lick them off or whatever it was to keep this cell perfectly clean all these months. It was an incredibly difficult time. She had no blanket. There was just 2 wooden planks on the floor that she was to lie on. Now, they were covered in bed bugs. She fortunately had a bobby pin in her hair when she was taken in. So she was able to use the bobby pin to slowly kill off the bed bugs, because every night she would wake up attacked from mosquitoes on one side and bed bugs on the other. And all this time she had to always clean up. She would take the little carcasses of the mosquitoes and bed bugs and move them over to the door and blow them under the door, hoping that they would kind of blow away from underneath this door. But all this time, she was violently ill. It turned out she had cerebral malaria, which is apparently often a fatal disease, leads to huge fevers and all these kind of terrible things. And so the only window in the cell was quite high up. And so one day she was just desperate for fresh air, and she pulled herself up to this window and realized at the top of the window ledge there was a knife. And she thought, this is a trap. They have me here, they're accusing me as a spy, and now there's a knife in my cell, and she didn't know what to do. She knew if she tried to throw it out through the bars of the window, her fingerprints would be on it, and they would be able to accuse her of being a spy. If she left it there, they were going to eventually search her room, they would find it and accuse her of being a spy, and for 3 days, she just prayed, God, I don't know what to do. I don't know what to do. There's nowhere to put this knife. The third day, she got back up onto this little ledge and looked at the window ledge, and the knife was gone. And she knew that despite everything that was going on, God was there and he was watching out for her. Like I said, this was an interrogation time, and so they often took her into questioning. I won't get into all of what that involved, but for hours she would be questioned, and for hours she would go through incredibly difficult things because they were trying to get her to confess that she was a spy. She would keep repeating scriptures that she had memorized. And so one of the most amazing things of this woman is she had just stored up God's word in her heart. And so all the time she is in the prison camp, things like, my grace is sufficient for you, or she had a verse from Deuteronomy. It was her life verse that said this, the beloved of the Lord shall dwell safely in him, and he will cover them all the day long, and he shall dwell between his shoulders. That was her theme verse. She knew that no matter what was going on, God was there and he was going to take care of her. One day, she heard noise outside her window, and so she climbed up again on these bars and looked out, and there below she watched as a woman was outside of this jail building in this sort of prison yard, and she went over to the fence, and all of a sudden a hand came through the wires and passed a banana. Now, by this point, I should tell you, by the time she finally leaves this prison room, she weighed 60 pounds. This is a full-grown woman. She's not like a tiny, petite woman. She's, a healthy person before this. 60 pounds, so she's violently sick. She's eating next to nothing, and she sees this banana, and she prayed, Lord, could you just give me one banana? And then she stopped, and it's actually really interesting if you ever hear her. She actually, in the later years of her life, told her story a few times and traveled. She said, Lord, I'm so sorry that I'm not grateful for the porridge you've provided. But Lord, I don't know, even if you could provide a banana, I don't know how you would ever get a banana into my prison cell. She was to the point by now that between the dysentery and tuberculosis, the massive weight loss, the upside of it was, she said, her dress that used to fit quite nicely was so big that she was able to climb sort of inside it and keep the bugs away. The downside was she was on death's door. Mr. Yamaguchi, the commander of the prison camp, had managed to find out where she was. He had searched for her for weeks. And he managed to find out that she had been put in this particular prison, and he came to visit. He came to the door, and she began to cry. She said it was like seeing an old friend. Now, this is a man who was not a kind man, but she began to cry, and he understood how ill she was, and he said, do you have any message you would like me to deliver to your friends? And this was the message, she said, tell them I'm okay. I still trust the Lord. They will understand what I mean, and I believe you understand what I mean as well. With that, he left. A few minutes later, she heard the boots of a soldier coming in, and she thought, it's going to be another beating or punishment or whatever it might be. Instead, the door opened, and a man handed her a huge bunch of bananas. And she said, I just began to weep, and I counted them, 92 bananas. She said, I didn't even believe the Lord could provide me with a single banana, and the Lord provided 92 bananas. Over the next number of days and weeks, she lived off the bananas. I'm not a big fan of bananas that get spots. I will admit there's just a very brief time in the life of a banana that it is good for eating. But she enjoyed those bananas right through to the last moments when it was a shriveled up black sort of desiccated fruit, but she said it tasted so good, and it managed to help her gain a little bit of weight during this time. When the last banana was eaten, there was another noise coming down the hallway. They came for her, and they announced to her that it was time to leave. She was given her ring and her Bible, and she was amazed when she was given a dinner of beautiful rice and pumpkin until she realized, I'm eating my last meal. The man who had interrogated her all that time forced a confession from her. He grabbed her thumbprint. They wrote out a long thing, grabbed her thumbprint, put it in ink, stuck her thumbprint, and they said, that's your confession. You're guilty of being a spy. He actually was in the act of pulling out his sword. You know those big, long swords? He was in the act of doing that when all of a sudden a car came rushing in, honking its horn, brakes squealing, and a man jumped out and said, stop everything. And in the middle of what was supposed to be her final moments, God again intervened. Mr. Yamaguchi had managed to intervene on her behalf and had told the secret police that she was not a spy. In fact, she had told him of God's great love for him. And so someone who would do that, there's no way they could be a spy. She was shocked. As I said, by that point, she was on death's door. She saw a mirror when she was put back in the car on the way being taken back to the prison camp, barracks number 8 with all the other women. She looked at herself in the mirror. Her hair had turned completely white. 60 pounds, completely white, no strength left when she finally was taken back to her prison camp. She said the moment before she was to be executed, she said a song went through her mind. The lyrics were this: I'll live for him who died for me. She thought, what a strange, strange song to be singing in my last few seconds on earth. I will live for him who died for me, but I'm not going to live. But God intervened, and she did, in fact, live. About a few months later, we're now up to July 17th, 1945, American planes began to come and bomb this prison camp. All this time, the women in the prison camp were told by the Japanese that America had been basically destroyed. Every ship was sunk. There was no hope. They would just be there forever. They had no outside news, so they had no concept that the war had actually turned and that there was a pushback from the Americans. Until all of a sudden, they noticed these planes coming over, these bombing attacks. The women were thrilled. The only downside is their camp also looked like a military base, and so their camp was also bombed during this time. Again, you remember that when the bombs came, the women were told to get into these ditches. And so this one particular time, the bombers flew over. It was a horrific bombing. All the women were told to get out into the ditches. She ran out into the ditch. And as she sat there hiding and trying to stay safe, she realized, I borrowed a Bible from another woman, and I left it in the barracks, and I need to get this Bible back to return it. So she ran into the barracks as bombs were flying all around her, managed to save this woman's Bible. And as she's running outside with this Bible, bombs all over, the gates of the prison camp get destroyed, and she's able to leave the prison camp with a number of other women. And they're out there now in the middle of about 5,000 Japanese soldiers who have guns shooting at these planes that are flying overhead. And she said, she's crying out to the Lord, she said, I don't think anyone's gonna survive this. Amazingly, they did. They came back into the prison camp because there was nowhere else to go. They walked back into the prison camp. Her barracks was destroyed. This is a picture of the prison camp afterwards. I think maybe there's one more picture. This is them. Notice there's no shoes left, nothing like that by this point of the war. And there was another woman there who was in tears. Her mattress had been bombed. Darlene said, I found that such an odd thing that this woman at this point was worried about her mattress. The woman had said, but I had taken the mattress out of the barracks, and I put it in the trench, these ditches. It turns out she had put her mattress in the exact spot where Darlene had been hiding right before she went to get this Bible. Had Darlene not been prompted by the Spirit of God to go grab that Bible, it wouldn't have been a mattress there, it would have been Darlene. But God, again, protected her and spared her. It was not long after this that the bombings sort of ceased for a while. The women didn't know what was going on. Later on, they found out that during this time, the war had turned so much that the Americans were now evacuating prisoners of war. The camp that Darlene and the other women were in was one of the last camps liberated during World War II. And so even while the war had ended in Europe, the war was still going on in this small little area of Indonesia. And so bombings continued. It was horrific. Now there was even less food because the prison camp itself had been bombed. There was nowhere to sleep. There was no mattresses. There was nothing until one day, all of a sudden, they brought them 1,600 shoes for all the women in this prison camp. Now, the thing was, none of them were in pairs. They were all mismatched. And so they were just given these shoes because they'd been barefoot for all this time, as you can see, walking over some pretty treacherous things. And they were instructed to, find shoes. And they realized we're either moving camps and we're going to have to walk, or something has changed. Turns out it was the latter. Something was beginning to change. And on August of 1945, the prison camp leader called all the ladies to announce that Japan had accepted the terms of surrender and the war was over. After 4 years of being isolated in that prison camp, after 8 years of arriving in Indonesia, the war had ended. Darlene said it was the strangest thing. There was no cheers. There was just absolute silence. Tears flowing down. That night they had a worship service as they praised God. I do have to tell you one of my other favorite stories. So, and I'm not done yet, but I'm moving on from the prison camp here in just a minute. One of my favorite stories is they had terrible worms during this time. Has everyone finished eating? Perfect, I saved it for this point. So they had terrible, and nothing to treat them with, right? There's no medicines, no anti-malarial anything. So they just had these terrible worms. They said at night, if you looked over, you could actually occasionally see the worms come out of people's mouths or noses. And so you would be doing a favor for your friend if you looked over at night and there was a worm, you'd grab it and try to pull it out because that was really the only treatment. The other thing they discovered was incredibly hot onions. And so they would eat as much of this, some sort of really, really hot onion that they discovered as they could possibly handle. It would be like burning their stomachs. And it was the only thing, it was so hot that the worms would die. And then they were able to be worm-free for a short time. They also all had lice, and so they pretty much all shaved their hair. But anyway, there's so many other quite dramatic stories that we had to leave out. But the next day after this announcement, Darlene was called into the headquarters, and she saw her first Australian. The Australians were the first there to liberate this camp, and she was called in to be a translator. She spoke English, Japanese, and this Indonesian dialect, so she was often brought into roles of translators and translating a responsibility. And she realized as she was standing there translating for this conversation between the Japanese and the Australians that she was translating the arrangements for the Japanese captors, the guards and the commanders, to now become the prisoners in the very prison that they had been prisoners for the last 4 years. She was just shocked. She just couldn't believe what was going on. They eventually heard that, as I said, the war had been over for several months. During this time, as this transition was going on, she was allowed to visit the prison camp where her husband had been. She met the doctor who had cared for him in his final days. She was able to go and visit the grave, and she was able to meet a number of men who had come to Jesus Christ because of her husband's witness and testimony in this camp. In fact, they did a big meal. Like don't picture, turkey and baked potatoes by this point. Any sort of thing that was recognizable as food was a big meal by this point. But they cooked her a big meal to honor her and to pay tribute to her husband. At that time, she was also given 4 letters, 1 by her husband, 2 by Dr. Jaffrey, who unfortunately had died a month before the camp was liberated, and a 4th one by a man who had been with her husband as his health had deteriorated. He had died. It turned out, in addition to a number of other diseases that he contracted, he had had a heart condition. They'd never known it. He was young enough that they weren't aware of this, but the stress of malaria and dysentery and these other kind of things that he had gone through was enough that his heart condition had led to his death. While she was there, the camp commander called her back in one more time. And she went to him and she thanked him for saving her life. Remember, he had been the one to intervene. He had been the one to get her out of that execution moment. And he had said to her, he said, "I know that you will leave and never come back." And she thought to herself, "You're right. You're right. I'm not going to come back." After visiting the grave, the arrangements were made for her to travel back to the United States. It wouldn't be a straight journey. She was going to go first to Borneo and then to Manila and then be put on a boat that would eventually get her back to the States. But as she was being taken off the shore of this little island where she was living, her friends gathered on the beach. She said she didn't actually see them. She just started to hear the voices singing. All of her friends, some of the other missionaries, some of the people they had worked with, some of the people in the church they were part of had gathered. And here's the lyrics of the song that they sang for her. "God be with you till we meet again. By his counsel guide you, uphold you. With his sheep securely fold you. God be with you till we meet again." She had the tears stream down her face, and she said to the Lord, "I'll come back." There's some pretty interesting stories of the trip home, mainly to do with food, because you can imagine on a plane and seeing white bread for the first time. They ate as much as they could, but there was leftovers, and they were trying to figure out where you could store the leftover food because they hadn't seen food in so long. And the people were trying to explain, it's like, there's more food, it's okay. They finally got them to Borneo, where they had the first hot shower she had had in years. Can you imagine that? Not being able to bathe in a long, long time. I forgot to tell you one cool thing of that moment in that 6x6 foot cell. When she went in, she was wearing a dress. That dress became the rag she used. It was all she had to kind of clean herself with in all this time, pretty primitive, brutal conditions. And when she walked out of the prison, she said, my dress was perfectly clean. It's just an amazing thing that God had provided in that way. But they were able to shower. They got to sleep in a real bed for the first time in all those years. But her and the gal who was with her couldn't sleep. The beds were moving. They weren't used to the movement of a mattress. They'd been sleeping on a wooden plank for so long that they couldn't sleep in the comfort of a mattress. So they got down and they slept on the floor, and they said, we'll have to make sure we get up before they come and check on us, because they're gonna think we're crazy if we're sleeping on the floor and not using these beds. Eventually, she was put on a boat. The trip was 23 days. I think I've got a picture of the boat. Oh, I forgot the spam story. Okay, gotta hear the spam story. After the liberation, when the camp was freed, the Americans started trying to bring in food, but they couldn't physically carry it in by like hand and truck, so they brought in planes and they dropped food from planes, right? It's the only way they could bring it, but all the containers would break, and so they would drop these containers of food, and these women would try to gather it, but everything was just spilled. There was nothing usable. The only thing that survived, that. The women had never seen it, but they hadn't had meat in years. And so they just, apparently this was a life-saving moment as they got to live off Spam for a number of weeks while they finally were able to liberate them. This is a few of them. This is a few of the mission team when the camp is liberated. You can see they have lost some weight. This is the ship she was put on. 23 days traveling home. The problem for Darlene was that all the other women were getting letters from family, because when the announcement was made that the prisoner of war camp was liberated, people were informed, family was informed, people started getting letters, but Darlene got none. And as she was traveling back, she realized the only reason could be that her parents must have died. And she said to the Lord, Lord, I've lost so much. She came home with virtually nothing to her name. All she had were the 4 letters that she had received from this other man, a borrowed dress, a burned watch that she managed to save, and 1 spoon. No husband, concluding that she had lost her parents, and all the time as she was traveling home, she just didn't know even what she was going to do. No passport, no ID papers, no money, nothing. She cried out to God. They were headed for San Francisco, and she actually didn't really want to get there. She knew it was beautiful, and she wanted to be back home, but she didn't know where she would go. She would get off the boat, and where do you go? And so when they arrived in San Francisco, she was actually delighted when they announced that there was no berths, there was no space for the ship to dock, and so they were going to be diverted to Seattle. She said, it gave me a couple more days to just try to figure out what I was going to do. They eventually arrived in Seattle. She again checked to see if there's any messages or anything for her. There was seeming nothing there for her. She didn't know what to do, so she asked one of their prisoners of war, what should I do? And they said, well, ask the Red Cross for help. So she got off the ship in Seattle and tried to find someone from the Red Cross. Eventually, she found someone, and she started explaining her story. I have no money. I have no clothes. I have no papers. I don't know where to go. I don't know what to do. Could you help me? And the Red Cross worker said, well, what's your name? And he said, well, my name is Darlene Diebler. And she said, I've been looking for you all morning. I've got 3 telegrams from your parents. They've been looking for you. She didn't know how to use a phone because the phones had changed since she had been away. It now was like the rotary phone. So someone helped her phone her parents. She wasn't even able to talk. She said she was so overwhelmed. All she could say is, as her parents told her what had happened to the family. Her parents had moved from Iowa to California, and so they had been ready to meet her in San Francisco, and then heard about the ship being diverted. She was able to get a train ticket, and she was able to get home on November 30th, 1945, 23 pounds lighter than when she had left, with nothing to her name. She decided, though, that she would go back. She had made a commitment to the Lord, and she was going to see it through. In 1946, and we'll try to wrap up here real quick because I know our time's just about done, a young man by the name of Gerald Rose had decided he would also answer the call to missions. And he would go to the Whistle Lakes. He would go and essentially replace Russell Diebler, who was supposed to be at the Whistle Lakes. And he used a movie as he traveled around raising money. And the movie was the life story of Russell Diebler. And as he traveled near where Darlene lived, some friends of hers said, "We want to introduce you to this man." So she was introduced to him in 1946, I believe it was, just a few months after she had arrived home. And they were married on April 4th, 1948, and began ministry in Papua New Guinea in 1949. They raised 2 sons in Papua New Guinea, among the most primitive of tribes. They ministered there until 1978, when they moved to Australia and began a ministry in the remote outback of Australia. They finally retired in the year 2003 to Tennessee, and they died, both of them 5 months apart, in 2004. One final story. When Darlene left in 1945, Mr. Yamaguchi was arrested. He was sentenced to death for his war crimes. As I mentioned, he had been a brutal man. Eventually, that execution was stayed, and instead he was sentenced to life imprisonment with hard labor. That was all Darlene heard or knew until 1986, when Darlene and Jerry visited another woman by the name of Lise. We didn't talk about her. She was one of the missionaries who was in the prisoner of war camp with Darlene. They visited her because she had also moved to Australia, and she shared with them a story of a friend of hers who had gone on vacation to Java. And while in Java, this friend of hers met a priest who had just returned from a bicycle trip to Japan. And while in Japan riding his bike had broken down, and he needed to find a bicycle shop to repair it. And while in the bicycle shop having his bicycle fixed, he met a man who said, "Oh, I speak Indonesian," as they were telling their stories. And this priest thought, well, that's a very unusual thing. Not many Japanese people know Indonesian. What's your story? The man said, well, actually, during the war, I was a commander of a prisoner of war camp. And the priest realized he actually knew some of the women in this camp, and so they had a bit of a conversation. It turns out Mr. Yamaguchi now ran a bicycle repair shop in Japan, but not only that, Mr. Yamaguchi had also developed a radio gospel ministry where he was able to share the love of Jesus Christ with his fellow Japanese, because he had come to know Jesus through this incredible woman's testimony in a prisoner of war camp. Never underestimate the power of the gospel to transform lives. I would just remind you, as we come to an end of Darlene's life verse, "The beloved of the Lord shall dwell safely by him. The Lord will cover him all day long, and he will dwell between his shoulders," Deuteronomy 13. And you, my friends, are the beloved of the Lord, and you can dwell securely with him. And that is the story of Darlene Diebler. Thanks for being here with us tonight. Have a wonderful week.